Right, good morning, people. Today, hopefully, we go through, well, not hopefully, we will go through our last two of the Sylvia Plath poems. I can spend longer looking at Elm because I think it's the more difficult of the two poems to get your head around. I've sent out the quiz, remember, for a birthday present, so make sure you have a go at doing that before we kind of go through it here, okay? Because otherwise you're just cheating, because I'm going to go through the answers and hopefully that'll give you a good understanding of the poem itself. So in terms of what we need to look at, we need to kind of contextualize Elm. Now, unlike any of the other poems, we have a little epigraph at the start of Elm to Ruth Fainlight, so we need to understand why that might be important in helping us talk about the poem essentially. We are going to link in kind of overall debates about love essentially to the poem itself, because it's essentially a kind of philosophical discourse about it as a concept. I'll then link in kind of key terminology and then treat the poem kind of piece by piece. Okay. With Birthday Present, I'm just going to kind of talk through the key areas around Birthday Present. It's very similar to kind of, I suppose, Lady Lazarus potentially, some of the other ones, and just use that quiz to feed back and discuss some of the key points within the poem. Okay, so the first thing you need to do with Elm, and it shouldn't take you too long to do this, kind of 5-10 minutes at most, you just need to have a quick research. So you need to find out, who is Ruth Fainlight? What relationship does she have to Plath? Why would Plath kind of dedicate the poem to her? And also she calls the poem Elm. So what is the kind of symbolism of the elm tree? Why is it a symbol that she's potentially chosen for this poem? Okay, so pause me for a moment, find that stuff for me. Okay, so Ruth Fainlight is a kind of fellow poet of Plath. Plath knows her on a personal level. They do share kind of similarities in terms of the kind of feminist angles within their poetry, and some of the kind of content matter. But unlike Plath, Fainlight is slightly more optimistic. She's not as bleak as Plath is. So the importance of this within the poem, and this is a kind of dubious point, it's only a line of argument, it's not definitive. You can make the argument that essentially, because the poem is set up as like a discourse, that the voice of the elm can be viewed as kind of Ruth Fainlight telling kind of Plath about her experiences and trying to help her learn through this experience. It could be that it's a kind of reversal on this, but it does suggest that this is something kind of, you know, something around the exchange between the two poets has led into this poem. Okay. Now, in terms of symbolism of the elm tree in terms of this is a symbol of victory and a symbol of rebirth, are the two main kind of symbols that come with the poem. So the elm tree itself stands victorious over love, over its own kind of failings. It's reborn continuously despite the kind of the pains that go with this. So bear this in mind as we go into the poem, just kind of slightly contextual. Okay, so to kind of contextualize this further, I've got a series of questions around love that I just want you to spend a few minutes kind of thinking about, just because, again, it will help you understand the imagery within the poem, what she's kind of pushing for and aiming to kind of discuss through the poem. Okay, so they are these ones. I think that's all of them. I don't click again, otherwise it'll change the slide. So pause it there, just have a think about these, and then we'll kind of discuss it, and I'll just link it into the poem briefly, okay? Okay, so essentially Plath is exploring these questions through the poem. That kind of idea will why do we pursue love? Because it, you need that human connection. Humanity desires it, but we are aware of the fact it can bring pain. People can betray you. People can hurt you, and yet people decide that the good kind of outweighs the bad within this. And again, she explores other ideas within the poem, that this kind of love leads to this kind of pain, to a jealousy, to a kind of suffering as part of it. It's not just that it leads to kind of good emotions, but she kind of implies that, again, despite this, there might be a point where somebody would be like, right, sod it, I give up. But she's kind of showing through the poem that actually there's, working past that point, essentially. Right, now, in terms of the poem itself, oh, there was that one as well, never mind. You want to think about voice very carefully with this poem. Mainly it's the voice of the elm tree that's kind of speaking, the symbol of rebirth, the symbol of victory, but it does start off the poem kind of with the poetic voice, essentially. So the poetic voice introduces it, then it switches into the voice of the elm tree. So if you were having this in your coursework, you would want to discuss the changing voices throughout the poem and why that's important. And this is a kind of journey of self-discovery, of introspection on the part of the elm tree as they kind of describe their own experiences to the poetic voice, essentially. And it does show the ways in which these kind of past failures have scarred the speaker or this elm tree, but having said that, they continue to kind of struggle onwards, and it's actually given a kind of a strength here that we might not kind of expect. I know that's cut off slightly, I apologise. The voice within the poem does change at various points. So we've already said about the initial change. Now, at one point, you can suggest that the voice changes to the kind of voice of love itself. We'll see that as we kind of come down. So arguably, you've got three separate voices that run through this poem, rather than just the single voice that you get in a number of Plath's other poems. So you get this discourse structure, you get the voice of love coming into it as well. And just make a note of the kind of terminology here, or be ready to kind of skip back to it. Remember, we want to get a range of terminology in. I'm going to try and refer back to this terminology as we kind of go through it. As I say, with this one, we're just going to treat it kind of a little bit at a time. Okay, so yeah, make note. Anything that you don't know, look it up. Make sure you've got a kind of definition and that you can use it. And then we move on. Right, so here are our first two stanzas. We're going to do a bit like we did with tulips, but without any kind of scaffolding to go with it. Well, we've had the terminology at the kind of the start here. I want you to pause me at this point, spend kind of 5 minutes looking. The cat is knocking things off my desk over there. Sorry, I apologise. Right, hang on. I'm going to stop the cat from doing that. Anyway, sorry, a couple of things to kind of look out for here. Think about how the voice of the elm kind of positions itself, and think about those kind of questions as you go down. What does that imply about the poetic voice? It's still the elm speaking, but what do those kind of questions imply about the kind of poetic voice itself? So I would spend kind of 5 minutes or so going over it, seeing what you can kind of draw out here, okay? Okay, so the first bit, I know the bottom, she says. So our introduction to the poem here, it kind of takes a third person voice initially with the she says, but then it switches also into this kind of narrative of the elm tree. So I know the bottom, and I know it with my great taproot is the elm tree itself. And essentially within this, the elm tree is given a kind of a sense of experience, of knowledge here. The elm tree is the one who knows more of this than the poetic voice. So where it says, I know the bottom, I know that kind of lowest point, it serves as a kind of metaphor here. And we kind of extend the metaphor. It's an elm tree. The taproot is the big central root of a tree, the most important one in kind of giving it stability. And here it knows the bottom with the great taproot. So it knows just how bad things can get. And we get that kind of direct address that comes into it. It is what you fear. So it refers back to that original kind of poetic voice. We're opening this discourse here. It's what you fear. I do not fear it. So you get the kind of reversal then. The poetic voice fears it, but the voice of the elm does not fear it. I have been there. So you get the caesura in the middle of the line here. And it helps to kind of give a sense of certainty to this voice here, to kind of really push their experience essentially. And you can refer to the poem as essentially having a didactic purpose, and didactic essentially means that it's a teaching poem in a certain way. It aims to kind of give a moral message with it. Now, as the poem then goes through, you get these kind of a couple of kind of interrogatives, rhetorical questions, I suppose we could describe them as here. Is it the sea you hear in me, its dissatisfactions, or the voice of nothing that was your madness? And it's kind of the poetic voice, or the voice here even, sorry, of the elm, kind of, again, addressing our speaker and wondering at this point how the speaker perceives this voice of experience. Do they truly understand the speaker's experience? So is it the sea you hear in me, its dissatisfactions? Do you think of this when you think of me? Or is it the voice of nothing that was your madness? So what is it that they kind of are perceived as? And then from this point, the poem is going to kind of switch into the elm essentially showing the truth of this rather than this outside perspective of them. So again, the discourse within this poem becomes very important. So here's our next two kind of stanzas. Think about how it kind of characterizes love here. Think about where you could maybe kind of talk about change in voice. Think about kind of some of the metaphor, the symbolism, the imagery that kind of goes on within this. Again, just pause me 5 minutes, just spend time seeing what you can pull out and what kind of terminology you can apply to this, okay? Okay, so our initial metaphor here is kind of central to the whole thing. Love is a shadow, and essentially the image kind of evokes the kind of idea of something that's ever present. You can't get rid of it, it's always there with you, but at the same time something kind of insubstantial, something that you can never kind of catch on to. And you go into the next line, how you lie and cry after it, listen. And you can describe this as kind of having a kind of poetic pun as part of it. You lie and you cry after it. There's you can, the lie can either be lying down. It can be lying as in a literal lie, telling untruths to pursue it. The cry can be a cry of pain. It can be the kind of cry to get it to return, a kind of loud shout. Both times, but so there's an ambiguity. It sort of opens up the different possibilities of the way that people pursue this, and it follows on with this kind of imperative, listen. these are its hooves. It has gone off like a horse. And you've got a lot of caesura during this line. There's a kind of broken element to it. It's evoking that kind of sound potentially of its escaping away. The simile at the end, it's like a horse. You can kind of connect this into Ariel. She likes the image of the horse as something incontrollable, and as sort of, separate from the human. And then arguably in the following stanza, it changes to the voice of the kind of love itself. If it's like a horse and then suddenly it's all night I shall gallop thus impetuously, till your head is stone, your pillow a little turf, echoing. It can be love. It can still be the voice of the elm pursuing it. But I would say personally, my perspective here is it switches to the voice of love. And this first person narrative becomes the horse love. There's a certainty to this. Our modal verb here, all night I shall gallop thus. The adverb is important. It's going to gallop impetuously. So there's something of this being kind of uncontrolled, of almost thoughtless here, acting on impulse rather than planned. And then the image of the kind of the gravestone, till your head is a stone, your pillow a little turf. So there's that kind of escape to the point of death. You're going to pursue love until you die, and never actually kind of ever will you get to it. It's going to be kind of constantly echoing, the sound coming back. So we kind of return to the metaphor, which suggests something kind of distant, but returned to us from that kind of gap and gulf. So we then get the next couple of stanzas. And again, it's a bit unclear on the voice within this. It could be that this first stanza is still love. It could be that we're switching back to the elm. It's up to you to decide how you're going to explain that if you choose to do this as your poem. But think here, within these two stanzas, how we're kind of introducing an imagery associated with kind of pain in an area that we wouldn't necessarily expect this kind of pain to come into it. So again, have a couple of minutes, break down the stanzas, see what you would pull out of them, then I'll go through it. Okay, now these are quite kind of sensory stanzas in many ways, and they don't necessarily follow the senses in a kind of normal way. So you've got kind of synesthesia going on here. Remember that term that we introduced in class where it's kind of different senses all coming in. So, or shall I bring you the sound of poisons, where this rhetorical question implies the kind of some of the pain that love brings with it. And you'll notice the sound of poisons, not the taste of poisons, the sound of poisons. So it's blurring those different kind of sensory images together. This is the rain now, this big hush, and this is the fruit of it. So there's something kind of cleansing in the image of rain, of growth within it, the fruit of it. So we get this kind of growth image, the kind of silence element. But then we return to the image of poison. So we get the caesura again, and we kind of corrupt that natural image. It's tin white, like arsenic. And arsenic is kind of a very powerful poison. Please never eat any arsenic, people. And again, it kind of continues this pattern where it's kind of... Right, okay, sorry, cat interruption again. So here you get, in the first line of this second stanza we've got here, I've suffered the atrocity of sunsets. Now you get the kind of romance cliche, watching the sunset, but here it kind of changes round. I've suffered the atrocity of sunset. So the image that is kind of beautiful and romanticized is kind of broken here, and it's scorched to the root. My red filaments burn and stand a handful of wires. So the filaments, and we've had this image elsewhere, it's been in Lady Lazarus, where she's kind of described the filaments of herself. Have been pained here essentially. She's suffering. There's this kind of heat image, and love bringing her pain essentially, and herself as these kind of only held together a handful of wires. There's something kind of insubstantial created around herself here. We progress the poem through. Now, what I would say with this one, I'd probably spend a little bit longer looking at them. In the first stanza, as you look at it, think about the kind of the response to this pain, those other emotions kind of coming into it. Have a quick look up of the symbolism of the moon at different points, and think about the kind of the way she depicts a potential decision here that she could take, but she's going to kind of choose not to, essentially. So have a little longer look at this one, because you'll need to be looking up the imagery around the moon. Okay, so the image that kind of comes out here, now I break into pieces and fly about like clubs. So the simile implies something kind of violent that goes with it. The kind of tree image here, we kind of return to the branches, and kind of wood is what you typically make a club out of. And a wind of such violence will tolerate no bystanding. So, like she's done in a lot of the other poems, there's a kind of image here that suggests that she resents people kind of watching from outside, from judging from outside. A wind of such tolerance will tolerate, such violence even will tolerate no bystanding, nobody watching outside of it. So the metaphor kind of continues, and you then again get the caesura here. So a lot of caesura in this poem. I must shriek. So there's that from the kind of point of view of the voice here. There's something certain about this. I must shriek. So our modal verb coming into it again. There's something kind of the onomatopoeic here, the shriek, and it's essentially seeking catharsis. The love and the frustrations of it can spill out into a kind of violence and lack of restraint, essentially. Now, the moon is often associated with love, but also of kind of the cycle of rebirth and of kind of barrenness, essentially. So here within this stanza, the voice of the elm kind of presents a choice to us. She can either choose to pursue love, or she can choose to kind of reject love, to choose the empty path, to stay alone. But here they kind of personify the moon, and the moon also is merciless. So there is that other choice, but the moon representing that kind of, an absence essentially, is painful too. They're merciless, and she would drag me cruelly, being barren. So our adverb choice with the cruelly here, and the idea of a kind of unwillingness. She would drag me cruelly, and again you get the image of something nice associated with something bad, that kind of incongruous juxtaposition here. Her radiance scathes me. So the purity and the radiance, we often associate this with kind of a positive image, becomes a destructive image. It scathes her. And it kind of questions, or sort of not quite questions, but there's an assert, or perhaps I've caught her. Perhaps there's no choice around it. So again, move on to the next ones. think about how she sort of continues to depict that choice here, and how she kind of comes back to the image of love that she's kind of chosen instead, but how the images of kind of pain come back into it again. Okay, so we start off this stanza, I let her go, I let the moon go, that she presents this kind of image of the choice, but she's chosen to let that choice go, the choice of kind of choosing to be alone, to kind of preserve herself through that means. I let her go diminished and flat as after radical surgery. So we've got the kind of image of pregnancy here. She's letting the image of the barrenness go again, diminished flat, as you know, and similar to after a surgery, after taking something out. But there is a sense of maybe, again, it's this uncertain here, it's kind of an ambiguity, how your bad dreams possess and endow me. That there is maybe a kind of fear that remains of this while she's trying to choose to let it go. There's a kind of fear that goes with it. Or it can be the dreams of love that kind of go with it, but they're bad dreams and they possess her. So there's a kind of unwilling taking over of this. And we then get a new metaphor kind of introduced. I'm inhabited by a cry, and nightly it flaps out looking with its hooks for something to love. So this kind of desire within herself is kind of personified, and it's personified as a kind of bird figure, that it's constantly seeking, and seeking to kind of restrain something else. You get the image of the hooks here. It's seeking to kind of attach itself to something else. And then into the kind of next couple of stanzas. The cat is on one today. It's going to stop doing it now. It's attacking the window. Right, okay. So have a look at these two stanzas. See what you can kind of draw out from them in terms of love being a kind of love being a kind of love being a kind of painful thing at the same time as something that she wants to pursue, something that's anticlimactic, something that leaves her left wondering at the end of it, essentially. Okay, so within this you get, again, that imagery of kind of something pleasant associated with something darker, and essentially it's her desire here, her desire for love. I'm terrified by this dark thing that sleeps within me. So it's there, it's present, it's part of her within this kind of metaphor. It's a dark thing. There's sort of a pronoun here, the thing or the noun choice is something ambiguous. What exactly it is unclear. And that sort of implies maybe a not full understanding of it herself. And all day I feel its soft, feathery turnings, its malignity. So we return to the image of the bird here, and initially it's something soft, it's something feathery, it's something pleasant, but then we get the twist on this. It's malignity, something destructive, something associated with death and kind of corruption here. And you again get this kind of, I suppose it's kind of temporal marker. Clouds pass and disperse, this kind of image of time passing, and or it can be viewed as kind of, you know, again, an image of something insubstantial. They pass her by, they disperse, they, you know, something that seems present but isn't really there. So a cloud that you can kind of see but is not really got any substance to it, so it can reflect love as well. And she asks a couple of kind of rhetorical questions that kind of follow this to kind of explore it further. are those the face of love, those pale irretrievables? And it's essentially kind of the image of her, walking through the street, essentially. I kind of imagine it as, and her kind of looking at the people she passes by, those strangers to her, and these people are the kind of the pale irretrievables. They could be the faces of love, but they're strangers, and once she's passed them by, they become pale, they become irretrievable. There's this potential that there's no kind of action on. And she kind of questions, is it for such I agitate my heart? So that kind of idea of agitation, that's something kind of unpleasant within the image, and her kind of seeking here to pursue it, but also the discomfort that she kind of associates with it. We're coming towards the end now. So think about these kind of last couple of stanzas, and the way that it kind of closes down and depicts the image of love, but at the same time we're still going to pursue this image of love. Okay, so at the start here, there's a kind of admission by the speaker that their knowledge can only go so far. So whilst there is that kind of teaching tone at the start, that kind of didactic element, it only goes so far. They have a knowledge, but not an entire knowledge. They understand more than maybe the poetic voice, but don't have a full understanding. I'm incapable of more knowledge. So that kind of comparative there, more knowledge, there's only a certain point that somebody can reach in relation to this. They cannot have a full understanding because it's a kind of an emotional element. So the face here, what is this face? This face so murderous in its strangle of branches, and you get the kind of breaking off here. It suggests a kind of uncertainty. This kind of, again, the image of the tree, but this kind of a strangle of branches, something painful and unpleasant within the image. It's posed as kind of a question here. I don't think we can even describe as rhetorical. There's an uncertainty that surrounds it. It's sort of, is it the face of a lover within it? Is it the face of love itself? It's something uncertain, but it's murderous. It's in a strangle of branches. It's painful. And it's these closing stanzas work around a kind of Garden of Eden image. So you get the kind of image of the snake, the tree itself, and again those images of pain that kind of go with it. The snaky acids hiss. So you get a lot of kind of sibilance within this that links into the kind of snake image, the image of the acid, and the kind of aggressive image within it. And the whole thing is depicted as something painful. It petrifies the will, so it becomes fearful, but it's also that stillness. If you get like petrified wood, it's that kind of fossilized wood. So it both terrifies but also stops people moving. It petrifies the will, and these the isolate slow faults that kill, that kill, that kill. So that fear and that inaction are arguably the kind of faults that are going to hurt somebody more than taking action in some way. We can argue here again different ways to interpret this end bit, but they're isolate, they're slow. So our adjectives are important, and that repetition, that each time it kills, it kills, it kills. So the repetition suggesting a kind of continual cycle of kind of pain potentially going with it. So that's how, as I say, you'll be able to use other resources to kind of go around these to find out more in relation to them. We'll try and do birthday present very, very quickly, just to give you an overview, enough that you could potentially do it as your coursework within it. So I sent you the overview to do with the quiz yesterday, but let's just kind of go through this quickly. the idea, a conceit is a kind of an image within a poem that repeats, or a central image that's kind of there the whole way through. And the birthday present itself is death, essentially. And if you're describing death as a birthday present, then it's something attractive, it's something people want, it's something exciting for her. And essentially what Plath is suggesting is that given that her everyday life is kind of harsh, it's boring, it's unpleasant, then death may well be preferable to her. But there is still a kind of uncertainty that runs through this. Now, again, voices become important. I want to see you talking about voices within your coursework. And within this one, there's essentially that attempt within the speaker's own mind to kind of persuade themselves here. So they're essentially talking to themselves around this kind of idea of the debate. And very often it's those images of the domestic that show her as kind of entrapped here. She's in pain because she's confined as a woman to this very domestic sphere. And she's essentially haunted by the kind of the possibility of death. What it can bring to her is kind of inescapable. Okay, so what I want you to do, you should have kind of pulled up, if you pull up the quiz again for me from the link yesterday, I'll just go through the answers to that one. If you haven't done it already, please don't cheat, have a go at doing it before, and I'll kind of justify why I've picked the bits that I've kind of picked. Okay, so grab that up quickly so you can refer to it. Okay, so in relation to this, as I say, this is just taking you through it quickly. At the moment, it looks like Abby's in the lead, so we'll see if anybody can overtake on that. The domestic life. So she's bored and frustrated by the domestic life. There are other images that you could take from the poem that kind of go with this. I would take, when I'm quiet at my cooking, I feel it looking, I feel it thinking. So the it here is the birthday present, it's death. It's an interesting line because you get several internal rhymes within this, alongside the kind of personification. So it's personified, she feels it looking, but she feels it looking while she's cooking, so that kind of domestic chore that goes with it. And she feels it thinking, it's kind of its presence here imposing upon her. So look for other images that kind of suggest the same thing as it kind of goes through it. But that's a nice line because, as I say, the personification, the internal rhymes, how that kind of intensifies it, and within it. Our next question, so she's separated from her goals by this kind of earthly responsibility. Well, remember, she's seeking death, but she's a mother, she's got her children. So the veil that kind of separates her from death is kind of white as baby's bedding and glittering with dead breath. So that kind of separation is linked in to those kind of more domestic images here. The kind of the baby's bedding that kind of goes in with it. But it's still made to seem attractive. It's glittering here. So our verb choice becomes important, but it's glittering with dead breath. So it also becomes a kind of disturbing image within it. Then we have the uncertainty about this kind of supposed gift. And I would take the kind of, the opening line essentially of the poem. What is behind this veil? Is it ugly? Is it beautiful? Where she's posing this kind of question, the interrogative here, and you get the antithesis within it. There's an uncertainty within this question. Is it ugly? Is it beautiful? She doesn't know, and therefore that makes it ever more kind of terrifying, essentially. Then we have my fourth question. Yeah, so she's pleading with herself, or at the world at large, so other people around her, to allow her this. And I would take here, do not be mean, I'm ready for enormity, where the enormity is the enormity of death. She is in her own life kind of confined, and it's a small life she kind of depicts it as here. There's no kind of enormity to it, but death is the enormity. And there's an imperative tone here. Don't be mean. Give me what I want. This kind of pleading aspect to it. As we go down, yeah, she fears these kind of potential long-term consequences. So one of the things that kind of holds her back from doing this is that she fears that beyond simply the short term around her death, that it will have a lasting impact. So what I would take here is that kind of bossed brazen, an antique shield, a marvel to your grandchildren. So that idea of an antique, something passed down generation to generation, and that would be the memory of her death in a kind of metaphorical way. Her death becomes this kind of antique shield. And it's even to the grandchildren, this kind of action will be a kind of a marvel. It will be, something that they still look back on. And, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this is exactly what did happen. She does affect her children in a kind of significant way through this. Now, the next one, where she kind of implies that she believes, as opposed to other people who maybe think that it's going to be loud and noisy, she'll be able to simply fade away, and this will be a kind of quiet death and escape. And for this one, I would take, you will not hear me opening it, no paper crackle. So we return to this kind of central conceit of the birthday present, or the kind of extended metaphor here. And there's a certainty around this. Our modal verb comes into it. It's direct address to either the other side of herself or to the kind of wider public. You will not hear me opening it. So the certainty here, they won't hear the sound of it, and there will be no paper crackle. So whilst we've got the kind of onomatopoeia here, you've also got the negation of it, so there'll be no paper crackle. Then we have the monotony that's kind of killing her pleasure here. And I would simply take the adding machine. And you've got to consider some of these with the kind of stanzas that follow either side as well. And the adding machine itself is a kind of symbol of monotony. It's sort of a primitive calculator, essentially. You're thinking about this back in the 1950s. And it's only got one purpose. It just performs the same action over and over again. And she sees the adding machine as kind of central within her life. It affects her in the kind of same way. Then we get, the idea that death is kind of bigger and more spectacular than life. I would take for this one, it stands at my window, big as the sky. So again, it's the image of the birthday present, but again, it's personified. It stands at the window, and the simile that goes with this, it's as big as the sky, it's huge, it's something spectacular, it's something awesome within her mind here. And there's kind of a terror that goes with it as well, almost, but it's something spectacular. And then the last couple, I've kind of put within the question, her separation from Hughes may be a kind of key part in this. Just remember, you don't need masses of context when answering these questions. So don't worry too much about that, but you can simply say that, the separation from a male figure or the kind of failure of love may be important within this desire. And you get the image: split lives congeal and stiffen to history. And it's placed, if you look at the stanza as a whole, within association with the bed as well. So that idea of kind of split lives and congeal, that kind of liquid, kind of thickening and stiffening and drying out, and it becomes simply history here. And the last question I kind of posed. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, she'd rather live her life now, essentially, than have it parceled out in tiny chunks. And she says, again, and it takes this kind of imperative tone, the answer I would have here: let it not come by the mail, finger by finger. Well, the mail is kind of slow. The idea kind of finger by finger, something monotonous, only in tiny pieces does her kind of life come to her. She doesn't want that. She would rather kind of live now, live it all in a kind of condensed chunk, than have it given to her tiny piece by tiny piece. Right, okay, almost done for the day. Last couple of points here, okay. I know that's kind of brief, but I think that gives you a good overview of the poem with the kind of key ideas within it coming into it. What you need to now start thinking about is actually doing your draft of the coursework, and I will send the kind of reminder sheet with this when I send it out. And you will choose one of the poems. That will be your kind of central one. Remember the word count, so it's about 1,000 of your own words, between 150 and 200 words of quotation that you can have on top. Focusing just on AO1 and AO2, so you don't need massive context in there. You're focusing on the poetic techniques that are being used. So you might have the odd bit of context, but only to kind of help you contextualize the whole poem and its meaning here. Don't overstress about this. It's in the different kind of mock exams you've done over 1,000 words. You can use other resources alongside, as long as you kind of have them in your bibliography. You don't need to reference them within there, as long as you don't plagiarize, though, obviously. But, you know, look up different analysis of these poems to help you. I'm always here, so you can ask questions if you're kind of confused about how you might work something in as well. But you need to now start thinking about those different, actually doing the coursework even, and your deadline for this, you're going to have the next 2 weeks over the half term in which to kind of complete it. Okay. Goodbye for now, people.